In 1870, the Indiana Methodists gathered for their annual conference. They gathered at a local college, and in the middle of the conference, the president of the college spoke up, and he shared that he said, "I think we're living in an exciting age." And the presiding bishop of the annual conference, Bishop Wright, asked him, what is it that you see in our future? And the college president said, "I see that we are heading toward a time of great inventions. In fact, I believe that in our lifetime we will see men fly through the air like birds." And the bishop was indignant. He said, "Heresy! The Bible says flight is reserved for angels, and we will speak of this no more in this conference." And this kind of hush fell over, and they went forward. And when the annual conference was over, Bishop Wright went back home to his two young sons, Orville and Wilbur. And on the 17th of December in 1903, as we all know, after several failed attempts at the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, those two men did what nobody had done before them. They flew. And they were so excited that they immediately wired their sister. And they said, "We have actually flown 120 feet. We will be home for Christmas." And she was so excited that she ran down to the local newspaper office. And she shoved what was probably the most noteworthy telegram of the century into the hands of the city editor. He took it, he read it carefully, he smiled at her, and he said, "How nice, the boys will be home for Christmas." And the next day, buried on page 16, under the obituaries, it said this: "Local bicycle merchants to spend the holidays at home." One of the most amazing, certainly a major event of the 20th century. And this editor completely missed it. And it was right under his nose. And you say, well, why did he miss it? It was because it seemed so unlikely that he couldn't even imagine it to be true. Well, today we can continue our current sermon series, A Journey of Hope. This is a journey that's going to take us all the way to the 8th of April, Easter Sunday. And through this series, we're going to walk all the way through the Easter story. And we're going to stop along the way to meet some unlikely characters and to see some unexpected events. Today we're going to do what I'm calling an unexpected stop. And we're going to consider the fact that grace tends to show up in the least likely of places. So we all know the story that's found in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 5 through 11. It's a story about grace in an unlikely place. It's the story of the loaves and the fishes. You know, the 5,000 people are gathered on the hillside, and they don't have enough to eat, and the disciples say, "Hey, these people are grumbling, we need to do something." And Jesus says, "Well, how much money would it take to buy food for them?" And they're like, "We don't have close to that much money." But one of them says, "Well, this little boy has some fish and some bread that his mom sent him in his lunch." And if you remember the story, Jesus tells everybody to sit, and he breaks the bread and the fish, and he passes it, and it multiplies as it goes through the crowd and feeds everybody. And this unexpected grace happens in the midst of this really large gathering. Familiar story. And in the story, it's Jesus who offers the grace. But now I want to look at a gospel story that's not so well known, not so familiar. And it's also about grace, but in this case, it's grace that's offered not by Jesus, but offered to Jesus. It's from the Gospel of Mark, 14th chapter, first 9 verses. Hear these words. "There were only 2 days before the Passover, the feast of the unleavened bread. And the leading priests and the teachers of the law were trying to find a way to trick Jesus, to arrest him and kill him. 'We must not do it during the feast,' they said. 'The people might cause a riot.' Well, Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon, and while Jesus was eating, a woman approached him with an alabaster jar filled with very expensive perfume made from pure nard. And she opened the jar and she poured the perfume on Jesus' head. And some who were there were quite upset, and they said, 'Why waste perfume? It's worth a full year's work. It could have been sold and the money given to the poor.' And they got very angry with the woman, but Jesus said, 'Leave her alone. Why are you troubling her? She did a beautiful thing to me. You will always have the poor with you. You can help them anytime you want, but you won't always have me. This woman did only the thing that she could do for me. She poured perfume on my body to prepare me for burial. I tell you the truth, wherever the good news is preached, what this woman did will be told, and people will remember her. So we get this story that really doesn't get a lot of work. A lot of people don't really know this story. But it tells of this beautiful and very unexpected thing that this unnamed woman did for Jesus. It's thought that during the last week of Jesus' life, between the coming into Jerusalem on Sunday, Palm Sunday, and the arrest on Thursday night, it's thought that during that period of time, he spent his evenings in Bethany with his friends. Bethany was kind of like St. Joe's, kind of a bedroom community for Jerusalem, and it's thought that that's where he spent his nights there. And one evening, while dining with his disciples at the house of a man named Simon, this woman comes in. And if you've ever heard the song, The Woman with the Alabaster Jar, this is her. This is the woman with the alabaster jar. And she enters the room, and she has this expensive perfume. And she pours it over Jesus' head. She just pours it over his head. And you think about it, this was one of the last acts of kindness that anybody showed Jesus before his crucifixion. And of course, wouldn't you know it, the disciples complain about it. You see, there are some Christians who are just so critical that they feel this uncontrollable need to complain about absolutely everything so strongly, I believe they would have sent the wine back from the Last Supper. These are people who always very carefully measure themselves out with a medicine dropper, determined not to spend one drop more than they absolutely have to, giving the bare minimum. They're so afraid to give themselves away for fear that there won't be enough of them left. And sadly, they haven't figured out yet about the good news of Jesus Christ, that the only real way to find yourself is to give yourself away in the name of Jesus Christ. This ecstatic self-giving that this woman does is contrasted by the penny-pinching nature of the disciples. But the woman proves to us that you can't outgive God. So it's easy to say all that, but I think probably many of us would have asked the same question the disciples asked. Why would you do that? Why would you waste that perfume? It could have been sold and the money could have been used for the poor. Did you catch how much money we're talking about, by the way? Very expensive perfume. A worker in Jesus' time made about 1 denarius a day. And if you do, as Jethro Bodine would have said, if you do the ciphering, to pay for this perfume would have cost about a year's pay. Pretty pricey stuff. So it's easy to think, well, that's ridiculous. That's outrageous. Why in the world would you do that? Pour all of that, pour a year's salary out in one grand, wasteful gesture. Sounds like a legitimate question under the circumstances. It's easy to understand why the disciples would have found that to be a wasteful act. And yet, there is special beauty in, and here's an interesting phrase, Kevin, right here, unconditional love. There is a special beauty in unconditional love, because in this single moment of wild abandonment, this woman does something beautiful for Jesus. Now, there is a time and a place for cool, calculating reason to lead in our faith. But there also needs to be room for wild, joyous giving. To be given out of gratitude, to be given with an overflowing heart. Did you notice that Jesus praises this woman for her unselfish act? He says, she did a beautiful thing to me. Beautiful. The Greek word for that Jesus uses is kalos. And it means either morally right or aesthetically pleasing. Okay, so beautiful here means either morally right or aesthetically pleasing. I think here it means both. And I think it means even more than both. Also, think about this. What she did is admirable because it's timely. It's timely. Jesus is about to die. He's days away from the cross. And he knows it. And you have to wonder if maybe she knew it too. Now, those who complain may have had logic on their side, but they seemed more than a little shy in the love department. Because this woman's gift, it grows out of a deep personal love for Jesus. She breaks all the rules. She defies all common sense. She's spontaneous. She's uncalculated. She's unselfish. And she is timely. It was a gray Friday in January of 2007. It was the peak of the early morning commuter rush when an unassuming young man wandered into L'Enfant Plaza, the train station there in Washington, D.C. And as the crowds rushed by, this unassuming young man opened a violin case. He threw in a couple of coins and $1 to do what he called priming the pump, and he began to play on his violin. But this was no ordinary street musician. This was a man named Joshua Bell, a young man who was a renowned violin virtuoso. A young man who 3 days earlier had had audiences shelling out $200 a ticket just to hear him play. And now, a few feet away from these hustling and bustling and clueless commuters, he played his heart out on his multi-million-dollar Stradivarius violin. He began with a piece called Chaconne, which is Bach's Partition number 2 in D minor. And it's said to be one of the most difficult violin solos ever written. And of course, these busy commuters, recognizing the sheer artistry, stopped in their tracks, mesmerized by the master violinist. Right? Wrong. In the first 3 minutes of his concert, no one acknowledged anything at all. They just continued to hurry by with their heads down and their minds elsewhere. At the 4-minute mark, a woman hurrying by tossed $1 into Bell's open violin case. And after 6 minutes, one commuter stopped and leaned against the wall and listened to this gift that was pouring out of this classic violin. Bell played for 43 minutes that morning, and he made $32. He was quoted as saying, better than minimum wage. You see, each one of us is designed to be a human Stradivarius, a series of vibrating strings on which Jesus himself plays symphonies of love and of truth. How unexpected is the grace of God? Hear these words from the book of Isaiah, chapter 64. Tear open the skies and come down to earth so that the mountains will tremble before you. Like the fire that burns the twigs and makes the water boil, let your enemies know who you are. And then all the nations will shake with fear when they see you. You have done amazing things, God, that we didn't expect. You came down and the mountains trembled before you. From long ago, no one has ever heard of a God like you or seen a God besides you, one who helps people who trust you. You see, if love is to be genuine, it has to have a certain extravagance to it. It just does. In 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, it says that love doesn't count the cost. Love lives beyond its means. Love always gives itself away with abandonment. I think one of the true tragedies of life is when we feel compelled to do something beautiful, and yet we don't do it. We refrain from it because we have second thoughts and we have doubts, and we linger long enough that it doesn't happen. The impulse to send that thank you note, to let somebody know that you love them, to give a special gift or speak a special word, those things come, and then we let them go just as quickly. We leave the deeds undone and the words unspoken. Because the most beautiful part about doing beautiful things for other people, when you do something beautiful for somebody else, you are in fact doing it for Jesus Christ. He says in the Bible, insomuch as you have done it to the least of these, you have done it to me. So we need to ask ourselves this morning, what would you do if Jesus was physically sitting next to you in the pew? How would you relate to him? If Jesus was sitting there, how would you greet him? If the person that you see in the parking lot after church today was Jesus, what would you say to him? If all the people that you meet tomorrow when you're going to work were Jesus, how would you act toward them? Well, guess what? According to the Bible, they are. For as much as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. Because what you do to them or for them, you do to or for Jesus. It seems like such an unlikely gift. Born in an unlikely place, born to unlikely parents, and born for an unlikely purpose. The whole thing seems unlikely, but instead, it is actually the work of God. Don't miss it. Don't miss that work of God like the editor of the paper did when the Wright brothers flew. All you have to do is reach out and accept the gift that God offers you, that gift of grace, of unconditional love. All you have to do is reach out and grab it. It is right under your nose. As musicians come forward, would you pray with me?